Oh, okay. If you didn't get a handout, they are available in the back, so be sure you get a handout. This is a brand new one for today. So let's begin with the word of prayer. Gracious Father, we are so thankful once again for your extreme goodness to us that just floods us on a daily basis. We thank you for the loveliness of even this season of the year with the sights, with the smells, with the activity as we see farmers harvesting crops. And we rejoice at your provision for us. We thank you that you've kept us healthy and met our needs. But most of all, we thank you for our spiritual health through Jesus Christ our Lord. And we pray that you will help us through a class even such as this today to grow stronger in you, to be growing up in the Lord, to be spiritually mature so that we can have discernment, so we can make wise decisions, so we can do those kinds of things that honor you. We thank you for our Kaysville Bible Church family and for your matchless goodness to us, and look forward, if you would be pleased, that next week we could open things up a little bit more with children's programs and so on, so that we can even have a more effective ministry. But we look to you for direction in all things now, in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen. Okay, last week as we concluded, um, we were talking about chapter 11 and verses 2 through 45. We said, remember, this is basically like the vision that Daniel is going to have, or that God gives to Daniel. And this can kind of be some heavy sledding, but just real quick 1 minute summary. Again, remember that basically from chapter 11, verses 5 to 20, dealt with the death of Alexander. Alexander came to the throne, and then he died after 13 years, and so it was his territory was divided among the four generals, and so we have here intertestamental history, this intertestamental period that, like I say, can be a little bit difficult at times, but it's a battle. During this time, we have the battle, then, two of the generals. We had the Seleucids, which is a reference to the ruling party up here in Syria, and the Ptolemies, who were down here in Egypt. And then there were two other generals that got part of Asia Minor and over here in Macedonia and Greece. But it's these two in Syria and Egypt that we find during this intertestamental period that have so much biblical um, interaction because, as you know, Palestine is right here. This is Jerusalem. Palestine is right in the middle of it. So when it first started out from about 323 to 198, the Ptolemies in Egypt basically were in control. They had, shall we say, the upper thumb, the upper hand. And then from 198 on down, we find the Seleucids in Syria, who basically had the upper hand. And so that brings us then to chapter 11 and verse 21, where we're going to start here in just a second. But last week, and if you weren't here to get the handout, you can see me afterward. I have some copies, but just real quickly on some of the takeaways we didn't get to last week as we talked about some of these technicalities. One of them was we said just the perfect fulfillment of everything we find in this section of Daniel is just incredible. And that's why liberal critics, that's why unbelieving scholars, I don't know how you can be a scholar and be an unbeliever if you're studying the Bible, but these people who claim to know so much, that's why they come to this and they say, well, actually, Daniel was written way down here in the 160s after all this stuff occurred, because there's no way in the world that God could have predicted it. But remember, God was predicting. Daniel was writing in the 530s. And what he said that was fulfilled to such a T here with over a dozen different kings of Syria and Egypt is just incredible. And the reason we can't stress this enough is because it reminds us of God's faithfulness to his promise all the time. You know, here we are right here, shall we say, the cross, and then here is the rapture. So we're somewhere here in the church age. Do you ever look down the road and think of what God has promised for us as believers down the road, and just kind of, wipe your forehead or kind of rub your eyes and say, oh, come on, can God, even God, pull that off? Can even God do that? That sounds too fantastic. And the point is, yes, God can and God will keep his promises. And that's one of the great things about reading the entirety of the Bible, especially the Old Testament. because we have the luxury of looking back at this and seeing how minutely it was fulfilled and say the God who fulfilled that so perfectly is the same God who will fulfill all this stuff in the future. And I mean, what spiritual backbone that ought to give to us when we think of the greatness of God. He's never a day late, He's never a dollar short. He always fulfills His promises, so we can say, take it to the bank. Bank on it, because what God says is going to happen. Second takeaway was simply the perfect complement between God's sovereignty and man's responsibility. All of these Seleucid and Ptolemaic kings were doing exactly what they wanted to do with their power plays, because they were what we would call, in effect, megomaniacal people. They were evil people who had their own desire, who wanted to expand their own kingdom, and they did exactly what they wanted to do. And as you've heard me say before, I guess I can't help but think there are many days when God is sitting at heaven getting a lot of good laughs, and He's saying, look at that prideful, evil, megomaniacal guy thinking that he's in control, doing exactly what he wants, and everybody's under his thumb. And God says, if only he would realize what a puppet he really is. Personally responsible, because he is responsible for making his decisions, but he's not doing a thing that confounds God or changes the plan of God. And then the third thing would simply be, a chapter like this is always a great reminder to us of that expression I use, a reverent agnosticism. You know, if we would have been standing back here with Daniel and we would have looked at this, we would have said, I wonder how that could ever happen. But from the vantage point of history, looking back on it like that, we say, well, duh, it all makes a lot of sense. Of course I can see how it happened. And that's really the way it is, I believe, when we think of some of these things. We look down here and say, how could they ever happen? And after God finally does it and we are with Him in glory for eternity, we're going to look back and say, duh, why didn't I trust Him? I mean, how could I miss that? How could I not realize God really would be able to do it? Why was I afraid to take Him literally? Why was I afraid to take that to the bank, if you will? So today we come to chapter 11 and we're picking up at verse 21. And again, this is still a little bit of heavy sledding, if you will, but basically this passage is only in chapter 11, verses 21 through 35 is going to focus on just one person. So as you see at the top of your sheet, remember now we're still in this Daniel 10 to 12, which is one unit in the book of Daniel. Okay, Daniel 10, 11, and 12 is all one unit. And in verses 21 to 35, as you see at the top, the major character here is this Seleucid ruler by the name of Antiochus IV, who also became known as Epiphanes. And we'll talk in just a moment why he had that nickname. He ruled from 175 to 163 BC, and he is indeed the type of Antichrist, or he's the forerunner of the Antichrist. So, what we see him do to the Jews at this time in history, because remember, the intertestamental period, we are now down to 175 to 163, and we're still BC. So, what he is going to do or what he did, that we have again the luxury of looking back on, what he did to the Jews at this time in history is a great picture for us of what the real thing, the Antichrist, is going to be like in the future. Because again, when you read some of those passages on the Antichrist and how incredibly evil he is, I mean, he is the personification of 100% evil. And you say, how could somebody be that bad? Well, we can look back at this guy and say he was just getting us ready for it. He was 99.9% evil, if you will. And we will see what he did here. We have that luxury of looking back and seeing that. Now, in 11:36 to 45, and today we're not going to get to the second part of this. We'll have to hold that off for a couple weeks. But in 11:36 to 45, the paragraph is generally interpreted in one of two ways. Because notice when you get to 11:36, it simply says, and the king shall do according to his will. So the million-dollar question is, who is the king? Well, two possible ways this is interpreted. You see on your sheet. There are some who say, well, it's primarily Antiochus IV, but anti-typically the Antichrist. In other words, there are some Bible interpreters who would say that from where we're going to start today to the end of the chapter, it's actually all about Antiochus here, but the farther you go in the chapter, the more it's kind of pointing forward, and there are things there that the Antichrist will do. Okay? Or secondly, a second way that interpreters take it, that actually from verses 36 to the end of the chapter, we are dealing exclusively with the Antichrist who is going to be active here during the tribulation period. Okay? It is going to be simply a picture of the Antichrist. And I think interpretation number 2 is correct, or the best one to take here, and that's how we're going to be interpreting it, because some of the things we're going to find in 1136 following, they have no equal correspondence to what we know from history. It is off the chart, if you will. And so therefore, I think there is a break between verses 35 and 36. So as I put on your sheet, we have a gap between verses 35 and 36. How many years would that gap be between verses 35 and 36? 2,000 plus, because when Antiochus IV is finished here, it's 163 BC, and the Antichrist hasn't come on the scene yet, because that's even after us, and we've already had 2,000 plus years of church history. So this seems to be one of those places where between verses 35 and 36, we have a gap of at least 2,000 and some years. Okay? And so today we're going to focus on the first part of this, which deals with history to us. And then, Lord willing, in our next lesson, we will deal with the last part of the chapter, which deals with that which is future to us. Okay? So, as I put the quote on your sheet there, the figure of Antichrist is very largely the figure of Antiochus writ large and thrown upon the screen of the future. So the more we can wrestle with or struggle with, shall we say, the passage we're looking at today, some of this stuff right here, the more we should be able to understand the Antichrist, because like this writer says, it's almost like we simply take this and we simply write it in even capital letters, bold letters, highlighted letters, because the Antichrist is going to be even far worse. So as we study these two individuals, Antiochus IV and then the Antichrist, as I put on your sheet, a good way to compare and contrast them is to look at their character, because when we start looking at their activity, we realize they do what they do because they are what they are. Ooh, isn't that profound? No, that's the way it is. We fail to think of that, but why when we see any megalomaniacal creature running around and we see people doing all kinds of ungodly things, why is it? It's because of what they're really like. It's because of the stuffing within them. It's because of the thread that ties them together. And so there are consequences for our thought life. And that's what we're going to see with them. They are what they are because they do what they do because they are what they are. Their activity, they're both very accomplished politicians. Both of them are very slippery tongued. Both of them are charming. Both of them are evil to the core. Now remember, we're talking about people in the past here and in the future. You thought I was talking about American politics, huh? Okay? So yeah, these are really evil individuals. And the last thing is the end. As much as they seem to be in control, it's almost like in this section, God revealing this through Daniel, just here and there, just keeps adding these tidbits saying, but then the end really comes. Oh, and there is going to be an end to it. And that's kind of his way, I think, of encouraging us. When we live in the midst of incredible ungodliness, what do we think? Oh no, what's going to happen next? How can we get out of it? Does God care? Does God know? Who's in control? And God kept telling Daniel, in the midst of all this, there is an end to it. These guys, and this is why I titled the paragraph as I did at the top, two incredibly evil men, but they're on a long leash. And guess who holds the leash? God. Yeah. And that's the way it is all throughout history when we see a Hitler, a Stalin, an Idi Amin, you name it. Every one of those guys, you scratch your head and say, why did God allow him to do that? Well, he had his purposes, and later on in this chapter, we're going to see God had his purposes in allowing this incredible evil. But every one of these evil individuals is on a leash, and God knows how long the leash should be before he yanks it and pulls it in and wipes them off the scene. So in the midst of this, we can be encouraged. So finally, we are in verse 21, chapter 11, verse 21. And again, I think instead of reading the whole chapter at one time or finishing it, we're just going to read it kind of in blocks as the paragraphs go together. So let's begin, and I'll start reading in verse 21 through verse 24. By the way, any questions, comments, corrections, additions before I continue here? I want to make sure you're on the same page as we start, since the weeds are going to get thicker and they're going to start wrapping around our ankles a little more. Okay, verse 21. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom. But he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey, and spoil and riches. Yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. Okay, so here we see now the rise to power of Antiochus the Fourth. When verse 20 had concluded, if you refer back sometime to your previous handout, you saw that Seleucus IV had been murdered. Okay? And as we noted at the end of last week's lesson, when Seleucus IV, now remember, Seleucus IV was one of these Seleucid rulers. He was up here in Syria. And when he came to power, as you remember, he had inherited the incredible debt of his father. Okay? And so he needed to find a way to pay it off. And of course, he went and he robbed temples and various things like that, and he ended up being murdered. Now, Antiochus IV, this individual that we are going to be dealing with so much today, okay, Antiochus IV is the one who then replaced him, and he is this vile person, this contemptible or despicable person we're going to be talking about here. But remember, as we saw last week, when Seleucus IV had this incredible debt to pay to the Romans, Antiochus had actually been sent over to Rome as a political prisoner, as basically collateral until the debt was paid off. But when Seleucus came to the throne, Seleucus said, hey, I'm going to bring Antiochus back from being a prisoner to Rome. And Seleucus said, I'm going to send my son Demetrius to be in jail, if you will, to be the collateral for this huge amount of money I owe the Roman government. So again, this is kind of a crazy anomaly of history, if you will, when you say, just think of it. This guy had been over here in Rome as a prisoner for years. I mean, wow. What if he hadn't been brought back? How would have all this played out? How would have God been able to fulfill it? And yet it's just through crazy things. I mean, historians basically scratch their head like, why would you send your son over here to be a prisoner and release your brother and bring him back? Just doesn't seem to make all that much sense. But that's what we see happening, and so that's how Antiochus IV got back there. So, as this verse begins, we see that Antiochus IV was not the rightful heir to the throne. The rightful heir to the throne when Seleucus was murdered was actually Demetrius, who was way over here in Rome as a prisoner. But that opened the door, that opened the floodgates, so that Antiochus IV, with all of his charm and his slippery politics, could come in and take over the kingdom. And so he's called here, as we begin the verse, he's called a vile person. That means he is contemptible. He is despicable. He's a very shady individual. In fact, as one writer says, he is a monster. Okay, and that's really true when we start looking at what he's like. Now remember this name Epiphanes, and you see this on your handout there. The name Epiphanes simply means illustrious one or manifest one. And we know from his coins, from Antiochus' coins, that he linked this particular phrase with the title God, and therefore he saw himself as the illustrious God or God manifest. So that ought to tell you right away why he is such a megalomaniacal individual, why he is such an evil person. He saw himself as basically replacing God. He says, in effect, look at me as if I am God manifest in the flesh. And as I think we've commented before, some of his critics said actually he's not Antiochus Epiphanes, he's Antiochus Epimanes. The word Epimanes means he's a madman. This guy's berserk. And as we go through here, we're going to see he really was. There's always, when you have people with such power, they're walking on a razor sharp edge, if you will, and you're never sure which side of the razor they fall off on that day, whether they're really deceitful or whether they've fallen into being almost out of their mind. Okay, so what does verse 21b tell us? It tells us that he comes into his place, because remember, he's not the rightful heir, so he's got to somehow convince everybody that he's supposed to be the next Seleucid ruler. And it says he comes in peaceably. Okay, two possible ways that you can take this Hebrew expression. It can mean he comes in peace or in quietness, and he just kind of, as we might say, he slips under the rug. It's like he gets his position, and everybody kind of says, how did he get there? He's not the rightful ruler. Who voted him in? Or it's possible it means there was a sudden attack. He did it unawares, where while kind of everybody was sleeping one night, they woke up the next morning and Good Morning Syria had their program saying, we're telling you that this morning Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV is now the new ruler here of the Seleucids. Okay? But both of those, whichever way you take it, it shows his duplicity. It shows you exactly how he's going to be one of these devious characters. It also says at the end of verse 21, he came in by flatteries. The Hebrew word that has to do with like smoothness or slipperiness. And this particular Hebrew root is used many times in the Old Testament figuratively when it talks about a person's speech or their tongue. If it says you have a smooth tongue, that's generally not a compliment. Or you have a slippery tongue, that's generally not a compliment. It means you know how to use words to trick people, to deceive people. You're a very, very slippery creature. Verse 22, with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him. And so we know, again, we have the luxury of looking back on history. We know from history that he had this army, and basically he overcame all claimants to the throne. Anybody who tried to raise their head and say, wait a minute, you're not supposed to be on the throne. I'm one step closer than you are. No, with his army, he was able to overcome every claimant to the throne, including, notice what it says, the Prince of the Covenant at the end of verse 22. So the big question is, who is the Prince of the Covenant? Well, one option that commentators, writers will say is they will say that it was Demetrius, the rightful heir. And that could be a possibility. I mean, since Antiochus was not supposed to be the next ruler, it's possible that it could be referring to Demetrius. But he's over here in prison. Okay, there are others who say no, it's actually a reference to Ptolemy VI in Egypt. Because in just a moment we're gonna notice ruling down here in Egypt at this time was a man named Ptolemy VI. Ptolemy VI. And Ptolemy VI was actually the mother of Cleopatra, and Cleopatra had been Antiochus IV's sister. And so there are some saying, some believe that this is a reference to the fact that, even with all kind of the chumminess with this kingdom, because his sister had married the ruler down here, he was able to overcome Ptolemy the Sixth. Well, we know that was true, but a third interpretation, and I wonder if maybe this isn't closer to the truth, it's a reference to Onias the Third. Now, Onias the Third was the legitimate Jewish high priest. Okay, so Onias the Third is the high priest here in Jerusalem. However, Onias the Third opposed Antiochus the Fourth. Okay, so if you are a religious leader and you oppose the political leader, guess which one is often going to win out? Okay, the first guess doesn't count. Yeah, the political leader, and in this case, for sure, it's going to be Antiochus IV. So what did he do? He deposed Onias, and he put a man by the name of Jason into the priesthood. Jason was Onias' brother, and it just so happened that Jason also paid him off. Okay? So, I mean, that's always a good way to ingratiate yourself to a political ruler, right? Slide some money under the table, or slide it over the table, if you will, but just pay him off and say, if you will confirm me in my religious position, I will actually give you money to do it. And so, if you'll bear with me, let me read a quick section here from 2nd Maccabees chapter 4, verses 7 to 10, where, remember, Maccabees is an apocryphal book, so it is not part of the Bible, but a lot of what it says is legitimate history. It's true history. And this is how the writer of 2nd Maccabees describes it. After the death of Seleucus, that's Seleucus IV, when Antiochus, that's Antiochus called Epiphanes, took the kingdom, Jason, the brother of Onias, labored underhand to be high priest, promising unto Antiochus by intercession 360 talents of silver, and of another revenue 80 talents. Beside this, when Jason promised to assign 150 more if he might have license to set him up a place for exercise and for the training up of youth in the fashions of the heathen, and to write them of Jerusalem by the name of the Antiochians. Which, when the king had granted, and he had gotten into his hand the rule, he forthwith brought his own nation to the Greekish fashion. Okay, in those last two verses, do you see what Jason the high priest said he would do? Because remember now, Antiochus IV, his big push is going to be Hellenism. What is Hellenism? Greek culture, Greek way of life. Think like your culture. Do what everybody else is doing. Get on the good ship lollipop or whatever. Okay? Well, Onias III was saying, no way in the world. That would go against what our fathers taught us. And Jason came along, his brother, and he said, tell you what, Antiochus, I will give you all this money if you will install me. And what I will also do is I will set up a Greek gymnasium. In other words, a Greek place to exercise, just like all the Greeks, etc. And I will help you convert everybody to Hellenism. Now, why did the Jews not want to be involved in going to the gymnasium and being part of that? It's because you would exercise in the nude, etc., and they would be able to look at you and say, he's a Jew because look at a certain part of his body, what's been done or hasn't been done to it. And actually, at this time, we know from history, there were some people who literally went out and had reverse circumcision, so that when somebody would see them in a place like that, they would think that they weren't a Jew because they weren't circumcised. And so this priest, Jason, said, I will give you basically whatever you want as long as you will establish me on the throne here. And so I think probably it's best here when it says that Antiochus was able to overcome even the prince of the covenant. It's saying he was even able to overthrow the legitimate Jewish high priest, Onias III, and put, shall we say, his own man here, because when you have a so-called religious Jew who is on your side in promoting Hellenism, what more could you do? I mean, it would be just like today, a government official saying, hey, you want to be a preacher? Well, yeah, we will establish you in your church if you will give the old party line of what we're trying to accomplish politically in America. How many preachers you think would gladly do that if they would be established by the government? Don't answer that out loud, okay? Sobering thought, isn't it? But that's, as we're going to see, and it's only going to get worse as we go on, but that's exactly the kind of political bargaining, etc., that's going on here. Okay? Verse 22. Okay, well, we just looked at that with the Prince of the Covenant. So, verse 23, after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully. So, Antiochus IV, we know, made a treaty with Egypt and strengthened his grip on Palestine. Okay? So, at this time, because Antiochus is stronger than the Ptolemies, he makes a treaty, etc., and he strengthens his grip here on Palestine. And notice what it says. It says he works deceitfully, through fraud, through trickery, etc. This is all back again to what we've just said. Keep watching for the character of these individuals, because every activity that they do is going to basically just lay their character out there broad as daylight. And then we know, because the rest of verse 24 almost sounds strange when it talks about how he scatters all these riches, etc. Well, we know that Antiochus was very known for plundering wealthy places, and then with what I would call political profligacy, he bought the allegiance of the people. So after he raided all these different things and got all this money, if you will, and wealth, he simply bought his friends. He simply said, "Do you need another $1 trillion? Okay, yeah, we'll sign off on that. Do you need this? Okay, we'll sign off on that." And therefore, of course, who's not going to want to follow somebody who is, shall we say, buying you off? But again, to note in verse 24, it says he will enter peaceably. Okay, same word that we talked about above. And as the end of verse 24 says, King James Version says, he will forecast his devices. Actually, he will devise his devices. He will plan his plans. He will plot his thoughts. The picture here is of every move that Antiochus makes, he's thinking down the road concerning how will this give me more wealth? How will this give me more power? How will this establish me more with prestige and confirm my kingship? But I love this expression even at the end of verse 24, in the midst of all this, even for a time, or as some translate it, it's only for a time. In other words, just when it looks like this guy is a runaway freight train who's in control of everything and he's got the world on a string, God says, but it's only for a time. There is going to be a limit to the ungodliness of this individual, and then he will be judged. Okay, so that's the first major paragraph here. Okay, the second one, verses 25 to 28. Let's go ahead and read that. And he shall stir up his power and his courage, so that he is Antiochus, against the king of the south. Okay, remember now, the king of the south is the king of Egypt, Ptolemy the sixth, as we're going to see. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he, the king of the south, shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his, the king of the south's meat, shall destroy him. And his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And both of these kings, Antiochus IV and Ptolemy VI, hearts, both of their hearts shall be to do mischief. And they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. Okay? So as your sheet says, this is Antiochus' Egyptian campaign. We know from history that in about 170 to 169, Antiochus IV made a campaign down here into Egypt. And as this tells us, well, it doesn't say it, but we know from history that there was a lot of international unrest. Because remember, the Roman Empire is going to be taken over within 150 years or so. So over here in the Roman Empire with Rome, there's starting to be a lot of unrest, etc. And over here in the east, And so Antiochus saw this as a great opportunity to attack Egypt with his great army. And so he did, and he was successful. And as we said, the king of the south now is this man Ptolemy the sixth. Ptolemy the sixth. And so the king of the south, Ptolemy the sixth, responded with a big army, and he says, "Wait a minute, I'm going to try and retake some of the territory I lost." But even though he had a big army, he was not successful. Antiochus IV is staying abreast of everything, or staying on top of it. Verse 26, what does it mean when it says, "They that feed of the portion of his meat will destroy him"? Well, the counselors or the advisors, it's a reference to the counselors or advisors of Ptolemy the sixth, who it appears gave him bad advice what he should do when Antiochus invaded Egypt. And because the advice was bad, it allowed Antiochus to get the victory, and it basically caused Ptolemy VI's defeat. So the very people that he thought were for him actually betrayed him, whether it was intentional bad advice, or whether they just happened to, you know, draw the shortest straw, or whatever, made just some moves that they thought would be good, and it blew up in their face. Whatever, it indeed was not a good thing for Ptolemy. So verse 27, the next move then is for both of these kings to meet at the peace table. So again, it's Antiochus IV, Ptolemy VI. They met, but notice what it says. Both of their hearts was set on doing evil. In other words, the intentions, or the desires of their heart was, as the King James says, to do mischief, that is wickedness or outrage, as well as to lie to each other. Okay? So again, you might say each of these guys deserves the other guy. So what were they trying to do, lying to each other? Probably Antiochus IV said, "You know what? You're having a hard time staying stable on the throne. If you let me do this to you, I will confirm you on the throne. So if there's anybody who's thinking of having a coup and overthrowing you, they won't be able to do it." All the while, in the back of Antiochus' mind, what is he thinking? I'll be able to take over down here too. I'll just sneak in. And maybe Ptolemy the sixth whole mindset was, "You know what, brother, that would really be a good idea. I need somebody to put a few more nails, in my throne to make sure it stands strong." But in the back of his mind, he's thinking, "Yeah, right. I know what he's trying to do, but if I let him come in, maybe I can do whatever." So here are both these guys sitting at the table, and both of them are lying through their teeth at each other as they're trying to both get the upper hand. Okay? So, as we continue, what does it say? Well, notice there at the end of verse 20, at the end of verse 27, I like again how God interjects this with all this political posturing, these two politicians sitting there trying to get the upper hand. God says it will not prosper because there is an appointed end. In other words, both of these guys think they're in control, and in reality, little do they realize what pawns they are. Now, what does he mean when he says, "For yet the end shall be at the time appointed"? Well, some interpret this as referring to the end of the Greek Empire, because remember, the Seleucids and Ptolemies had been part of the Greek Empire. And so when did the Greek part end and the Roman rule begin? Basically, we say that was 63 BC. The Roman Empire began. So maybe this is a reference to the fact that God is saying the Greek portion here is going to end and the Romans are going to take over. Or maybe he's actually referring to that which is end even for us. So maybe God is saying, but the end is going to come when God will set up his eternal kingdom, and then you will see what a genuine righteous ruler is all about. Again, either one is legitimate. Verse 28. Then shall he, that's Antiochus IV, return into his land with great riches. And his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. Okay, Antiochus is going to go home in a rage. Okay, remember, he's just been down here at the peace table, if you will. But in reality, even though his army had won, by the very fact he called off the battle and he went home, as historians say, he was basically acknowledging the fact he was defeated. Okay, so as he goes back home, he passes through Jerusalem, and shall we say, he's really mad. He's upset that he didn't get his way and everything didn't go as he thought. So, like we often say, I'm having a bad day and somebody's going to pay the price for it. I'm going to get mad at somebody just because I'm having a bad day. Well, basically, that's exactly what happened here. It's like, okay, who's the closest people at hand that I can vent my rage on? Well, he's already been upset with the Jews because they don't just bow down at his feet and capitulate. And so, as this text tells us, his heart shall be against the holy covenant. In other words, he is against the Jews, he is against the temple, he's against everything the Jews stand for. And so we know again from history that he ransacked the temple and killed many Jews. He basically took all the holy objects out of the temple. He stripped everything down, if you will. And so the quote I put on your sheet is, "It is here that the clash between Antiochus and the faith of Israel begins on a serious level." Because this was not just in Jerusalem per se. This was his decree that, okay, wherever you are in the promised land, if you are a Jew and you are standing true to me, you're in the bullseye, if you will. You are a target of my anger. And so this was after his Egyptian campaign 170 to 169 when he wreaks his havoc on Jerusalem. Now, but remember, this is not the bad part, okay? This is not when he goes into the temple and offers the swine and sets up the altar to Zeus and all that. That's still to come at a later campaign. But can you begin to see how vile this guy really is by what he's done this far? And basically, it's not for anything the Jews have done per se. It simply is they are not capitulating to his we all have to be good Greeks. We all have to simply drink the same Kool-Aid. And because somebody has to feel his wrath when he is just totally upset. Okay, I think we're going to need to stop there for today. So be sure you bring this. Well, actually, next Sunday we will have Sunday school because it's going to be promotion, Lord willing, and then we'll open up all of our Sunday schools again. So it'll be 2 weeks from today when we resume this. So if you can remember to bring the sheet back, if you can't, they will be available for sale that day at $0.25 apiece. Any questions, comments? Again, we've covered a lot today, but wow, the more you study the Bible and the more you see how this was played out, and we have the luxury of looking back on it and just seeing how God was at work through all this to the accomplishment of his purposes. This is amazing indeed. Okay, Lord bless you. Stick around for the morning service and then have an exceedingly great week.